Good morning and welcome to everyone. It's great to have you with us. My name is Myriam Huet. I'm one of the assistant directors at the Center for Public Service, and I welcome you to the first CPS Faculty Series workshop of this semester. Today's session focuses on the crucial topic of advancing anti-racism research with communities, and it's a pleasure to have Dr. Samantha Francois lead us into this workshop today. Dr. Francois is assistant professor at the School of Social Work, Sonja Bilger, Romanowski Early Career Professor, and Executive Director of the Violence Prevention Institute. It's also a pleasure to have Dr. Anneliese Singh with us today to introduce Dr. Francois' work and the workshop. Dr. Singh serves as Associate Provost for Diversity and Faculty Development and Chief Diversity Officer at Tulane. She's also an eminent scholar and a professor at the School of Social Work with a joint appointment in psychology. Her scholarship and community organizing explores the resilience, trauma, and identity development experiences of queer and trans people, with a focus on young people and BIPOC people. Dr. Singh is currently conducting NIH-funded work on trans identity development with a longitudinal cohort in New York, San Francisco, and Atlanta. Anneliese is the author of the Racial Healing Handbook, Practical Activities to Help You Challenge Privilege, Confront Systemic Racism, and Engage in Collective Healing, as well as the Queer and Trans Resilience Workbook. Without further ado, Anneliese, let me pass it on to you.
Thank you, Myriam, and welcome everyone. Happy Friday. Myriam's so generous to share my bio. This today is really about Dr. Francois. But Myriam, first I want to say thank you so much for all the work you do in CPS, and thank you, CPS. When it comes to the work of anti-racism, I know you all have been leading for a long time and really refining so many of your practices. So thank you for this attention in anti-racist research. I think my name is Anneliese Singh. I use she and they pronouns. I think, you know, we're in the month of Black History and Black Heritage Month, and we know that needs to be an everyday learning kind of thing. So I'm excited to introduce Dr. Francois because, you know, my commitment to my own professional development in this area as a learner is always growing. And it's an honor to introduce Dr. Francois because, you know, the research methodologies she talks about and we'll talk about today can be some of the most challenging research designs to address. It can be slow, complex, complicated, joyous, frustrating, enlightening, but all these rich tensions of complexity occur because the type of research that she'll talk about directly engage the needs of, you know, vulnerable populations, or we could say stigmatized, or we could say people that have been marginalized for many generations. And so I'm excited, especially in the 2020s, when we've got a lot of harm we're trying to reduce in the process of our research and the goals of our research. When I was, you know, looking at her bio, I was like, okay, I can read this, or I can reach out to like someone who I know actually really loves and mentors her. I mean, I'm just getting to know Dr. Francois. So I reached out to Dr. Michael Cunningham to see what he might say about Dr. Francois. And he said that not only is she an assistant professor at Tulane University in the School of Social Work, but she's had a rich, rich professional career associated with working to end anti-Black racism. Her research career has been incredible in that it's examined community contexts that contribute to or inhibit successful outcomes with Black and African American populations, and that her use of quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method is really pushing the field to promoting the assets of individuals, as well as the contextual experiences. Of course, he had to talk about your career as a successful student advocate. And I've seen you do that in so many spaces I've been a part of. And in terms of the way you move in classroom settings, he said that students always comment on your engaging teaching styles. As a faculty and advisor, you demand that your students meet that rigorous research standards, but that you always couple those with thoughtful insights. He says that you're the type of person who is respected by your colleagues, your students, and your community members, all with whom you interact. That's certainly been my experience in my short time of getting to know you. So I'm really excited from hearing from you today, Dr. Francois.
Thank you so much, Anneliese. That was a really touching introduction, and to hear that Mike informed it is really, really meaningful to me as well. I don't know if he's on here because the view I have, I can't see everyone. But if you're on here, Mike, I love you. All right, so I am going to share my screen so we can go into the PowerPoint that will guide our time together. Okay. All right, just in the way of some, I guess, kind of housekeeping logistics, I have the first portion of our time together will, be, kind of look and feel and will be more of a lecture sort of format. But if you have any questions, comments as I'm going through this first portion, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Myriam is going to support me with monitoring that chat. I will try to respond to those as quickly as I can. I have to be totally transparent that I am not very well adept at, presenting, facilitating a discussion, and watching and responding to a chat box at the same time. After we sort of go through that portion of our time, I will ask that you break out into small groups of 5 to reflect together on the content I have shared and put into the space, and reflect on it in the context of your own research practice, your own work as a research scholar, however you define that for yourself. And then we'll come back together with reflections from your small groups, and also, just a whole group Q&A opportunity. So hopefully that journey is reflective of what you thought you were going to do today with this hour. And that's what I just laid out on this slide. I forgot I made this slide. All right, so we're going to start by first sharing a little bit more about me and how I enter into this engagement with defining what anti-racist research is and how to do anti-racist research. And I want to qualify this, this 45 minutes by saying that we're only going to scratch the surface, right? I'm really hoping that for those of you for whom this is your first entree into exploring anti-racist research, that you use this as a jumping off point. And for those who are already, very deep into this work, I hope you can use it to continue to work around advocating for anti-racist research in our academic institutions and beyond. But in addition to what Anneliese shared about me, I wanted to share that although I am an assistant professor in the School of Social Work here at Tulane, I'm trained as a psychological scientist, where my research focuses on these 4 broad areas. I focus on adolescent development, and specifically the influence of systems on that development. And I also have prioritized the focus on neighborhood and race-based violence and its impact on adolescent development, and specifically the development of adolescents who identify as Black or African American. And I also lift up in my research community and cultural assets in African American populations that promote positive and productive developmental outcomes and just overall quality of life. In addition to that, or overlaid on top of that, is that I really think of myself as a researcher activist. And what I mean by that is that I do my research in the service of the people's liberation, right? I have a very specific and intentionally defined population that I aim to do my research with. And I prioritize that research being in the service of those people's liberation. And along with that, engaging in the social justice, racial justice, economic justice, climate justice work that it takes to transform these education, health, and criminal legal systems that have caused so much historical harm for certain populations and continue to do so. So if we are gonna talk about anti-racist research, there's an assumption built in that the research enterprise is racist. And that is a starting point for us, that we believe that the research enterprise is an inherently racist system, right? So I did not intend to sort of go through the wealth of evidence out there around this positionality, but to make you aware of sort of the grounding of the grounding that there is evidence around the research enterprise as it's conducted and operated in social behavioral fields, biomedical fields, and so on, is much, much like other systems that we think of when we think of systems of oppression and racist systems in the context of healthcare systems or criminal legal systems. So our research enterprise also is an inherently racist system. So I've listed off some resources here, and I'll have a reference list at the end of this presentation. Can definitely share this presentation with all, so you have access to them. If you have not dug into any of this literature, this scholarship around the ways in which the research enterprise as we know it is inherently racist, I strongly encourage you to do so. I put down here at the bottom that, and this is a way oversimplification of the evidence base around this, is that one of sort of the main really damaging realities of a racist research enterprise is that what is considered normative or the standard or mainstream is equated with whiteness. So anything outside of that is not normal, is deficient, is subordinate, and so on. And we can go on and on with those adjectives. So that's sort of what anti-racist research is up against, right? That's why it emerged as the need emerged to put forth an anti-racist research agenda. So what is anti-racist research? So I certainly have definitions based on the scholarship, but I want to start with hearing from you all, and not literally hearing, but if you could just type in the chat, whatever you know, whatever your gut tells you, whatever you feel that how you would define anti-racist research. Just go ahead and take a couple minutes or a minute or so to type in the chat what you think that anti-racist research is. And I'll kind of, speak out what I'm seeing come through. Research that advances racial justice. Research that seeks to identify and break down systemic racism. Research that makes an effort to decenter whiteness, embrace cultural humility, recognize the historical and systemic issues that create and perpetuate structural racism, Rooted in, ooh, they're coming fast, acknowledges the embedded systems of oppression, white supremacy, and seeks to dismantle. Yes. Aware of, accounting for, and working against racist structures in our society. I don't even think y'all need this workshop. This is good. Systematic inquiry that promotes liberation, focuses on systems that currently exist, and ooh, they're coming too fast. Actively acknowledges white supremacy. Yes. All right, I'm gonna say keep dropping them in there. But this is good. A lot of what is coming through the chat is certainly reflective of what the scholarship and the scholars who have written more and done way more work than I have around defining, conceptualizing, and really laying out what anti-research is. I offer this direct quote from Dr. Sifa Day, who is one of those premier scholars on doing anti-racist research and the pedagogy of anti-racist research. And what Dr. Day said anti-research is it's research that places the minoritized at the center of analysis by focusing on their lived experiences and the simultaneity of their oppressions. The research purpose is to understand social oppression and how it helps construct and constrain identities, race, gender, class, sexuality. We could add others to that list, both internally and externally through inclusionary and exclusionary processes. People of color, for example, Black women, experience oppression in a way that is different both in substance and intensity. Anti-racism research is not about becoming located or situated in another's lived experiences, but is rather an opportunity for the researcher to critically engage his or her own experience as part of the knowledge search. There's so many components of this, conceptualization of anti-racist research that are really compelling. And I want to just highlight a couple, and I want us to keep them in mind as we kind of go through, how do we overlay this conceptualization with the actual work of conducting research, right? Going through the research process. But one component of it that I would highlight is that it centers those who are minoritized, marginalized. They are at the center of analysis. The purpose of the research is to understand the oppression of those marginalized, minoritized folks at the center of the analysis. The belief that that oppression is both substantively and intensely unique and different, right? And that the research is not about, and I like the last piece so much, and I can talk more later about why, about becoming located or situated in the focal populations or focal communities' lived experiences, but rather to understand who you as the researcher are as you enter into understanding the experiences of that focal population or community. So Gupta talked about some assumptions underlying anti-racist research. Requires collaboration. And we're gonna see, I'm gonna go through these pretty rapidly, but we will see how they emerge when we dive into the process of doing anti-racist research. So it requires collaboration. It entails insider research, and it should bring about anti-racist change. So the nature of how the research is done, as well as the goals of the research, are reflected in these assumptions. So everybody on here, you know, I think most of us are faculty. I think we have some graduate students. You know, most of us are at Tulane. We know what the research process is. A lot of us are researchers. What I aim to do is kind of highlight here like the broad components, some of the broad components in the research process in order to plug in ways in which we can infuse anti-racist assumptions, conceptualizations in how we are navigating and executing a research process. So we're going to look at, you know, in the space of our theoretical or conceptual grounding of our research, the actual research questions and or hypotheses we develop, the methods that we use, and the findings that emerge from our research and how we disseminate our research. So when it comes to our theoretical and conceptual grounding of our research, if we are engaging in and aiming to do anti-racist research, our theoretical and conceptual grounding has to be anti-racist, right? So are there anti-racist theories? Are there anti-racist conceptual frameworks? Yes. I've listed out a few here. These are some very well-known theoretical frameworks and conceptual frameworks: critical race theory, intersectionality, strengths-based perspectives. Some of them are they are seen and used in some disciplines more than others. I wanted to say this at the beginning and forgot to say this at the beginning, you know, given my background and training in sort of psychology and work in public health and social work, a lot of my examples are going to come from those disciplines. Nevertheless, I do think that, and I do believe that these anti-racist approaches have applicability across disciplines. So even if you're engaging in biomedical research, you can use a critical race theory or framework as the grounding or the way in which you undergird the framing of how you frame your research questions, how you engage with your research populations and communities, and so on. In terms of developing out our research questions and hypotheses, if we are trying to do this with an anti-racist lens, we want to try to create research questions, develop hypotheses that move beyond simple questions of racial differences. So we have a long history of research that has examined the differences between racial groups. And often that research, not often, you know, there is a wealth of that research demonstrating, or what's the word I want to use? Concluding the ways in which, if we go back to that kind of the starting point that the research enterprise is an inherently racist system, that any racial group that is not white or non-European or non-Western is deficient, non-normative, and so on. So often in our research enterprise, when our research questions and or hypotheses are just focusing on questions of racial differences or examining racial differences, we end up with those sorts of results and conclusions. Another sort of approach to developing and developing anti-racist research questions and hypotheses is to not treat race as a control variable. We don't want to control for or eliminate the effect of race. If we're doing anti-racist research, that is actually, that race variable is something we actually care about and are interested in and are wanting to know and understand how that impacts, affects, influences, interacts with the particular outcomes or mediating or moderating variables that may also be relevant to our research study. This last suggestion for framing anti-racist research questions and hypotheses is framing questions that really examine cultural distinctiveness rather than disparity or deficit. So there is, and I know I can speak to this from my own experiences as a researcher who focuses, intentionally on African-American populations, getting feedback from reviewers on publications or on grants in a whole range of ways, that if I don't have another sample to compare that African-American sample to, then I'm missing something, right? So rather than, again, and this is kind of tied to that first guideline of moving beyond questions of racial differences, is anti-racist research, again, thinking back to that definition Day offered, is the minoritized or marginalized or population of color is the center of the analyses. So our research questions, if we're doing anti-racist research, are really about the cultural distinctiveness of that particular group. In terms of our methods and approaches, so how we are sort of executing our research, our data collections, what we're collecting, how we're collecting, our engagements with the participants that are a part of our research. There are methods and approaches that already exist, that are already in our wheelhouse, that are aligned with the principles and assumptions of anti-racist research. So qualitative approaches, and I'm sure we probably have qualitative researchers and scholars in the workshop right now who have a much deeper expertise in qualitative approaches than I do. But qualitative approaches definitely offer a way of engaging with research participants and engaging with the research process in a way that is aligned with anti-racist assumptions, in that the research participant or the focal population of the research is the center of analysis. Participatory research methods are also, whoops, I didn't mean to jump ahead just then. Participatory methods are also methods that we have available to us already, that are inclusive and are that promote the execution of anti-racist research. So action research, community engaged research, community-based participatory research. These participatory methods really speak to a few aspects of and assumptions of that anti-racist research, but particularly that assumption around the collaborative component or assumption of anti-racist research, as well as the insider. So we had that assumption about it being insider research. So if we think about community-based participatory research and that as a framework, the community that is the focus of the research is leading and or co-leading the development of every component of that research endeavor, from the determination of the research aims, the theoretical or conceptual grounding of the research, the theory of change, the development and selection of data collection methods and approaches. That focal community is leading and or co-leading those decisions. And that's quite distinct from more other or non-participatory, I'll put it that way, non-participatory based research approaches and methods. Another aspect of the methods for doing anti-racist research is around the measures and the variables we select. It's important to think about and select measures and identify variables and are indicators that are aligned with and are actually reflective of the populations and or communities that you are focusing on. I feel like I don't even have to go into a whole lot of detail about, the whole host of psychological measures, for example, that have been developed and normed on predominantly white, middle class, college samples that are then used with samples that don't fit into any of those identity categories. So we want to, if we're doing anti-racist research, we have to prioritize the identification and use of measures that are culturally appropriate, culturally grounded, and also that tap into the intersectionality that is also really prevalent for many minoritized and marginalized populations. In terms of interpretation and dissemination, when we think about how we interpret our findings when doing anti-racist research and how we disseminate those findings, I'm offering sort of three ways to, or rather three guidelines for doing that in the context of doing anti-racist research. So first, you want to involve multiple interpreters of your findings. You as the researcher or your research team or your lab members can't be the only ones interpreting and making sense of what your research is saying. You want to involve non-researchers, the members from the focal community, stakeholders from that focal community, or stakeholders or stakeholders for whom that your research has implications for, to look at your findings, interpret them, say what, and tell, and contribute to and add to what those findings mean, and how, and what those and what conclusions can be drawn from those findings. In terms of dissemination, if you're doing anti-racist research, you want to be thinking outside the academy box for disseminating your findings. So not just simply presenting at professional conferences or publishing in peer-reviewed articles. You want to be thinking about where are the populations, the communities, the individuals who need to see this research, who will potentially use this research and information. Where are they going to be most likely to find it or get access to it? So it may be things like social media posts, newsletters, blog posts, research briefs or other sort of briefs, press releases. So really kind of having the question of who gets to see the research versus who doesn't, and having that guide us in the ways in which we disseminate our research and research findings. So the last thing I'll say in this space of it before I move us into the breakout groups are doing anti-racist research is not without challenges, right? So some of the challenges I offer up for us to think about and consider, and really to think about them and consider them in the context of how do we overcome them, right? As within institutions and within research systems that are inherently racist. So some of those challenges is that the reviewers work, be it peer review, journal reviewers, grant reviewers, reviewers of all sorts, they are indoctrinated in these inherently racist systems. So they're going to be reviewing the research from that frame or from that viewpoint. So that could be a challenge in promoting anti-racist scholarship. Constraints and limitations around promotion and tenure requirements. Another challenge is the community or a community's views of research, the research enterprise and academic researchers specifically. We know we can have a whole session or a whole workshop about this one and the ways in which if you are aiming to do anti-racist scholarship, ways to address and overcome the trust of community in engaging in community and doing community engaged research. Another challenge is that often our stakeholders within communities are often overextended. So we have to think about ways in which to overcome that as a challenge. And then another challenge is the impact of one's own identities, values, background experience, et cetera, on the research. Who we are inevitably is going to creep into all of these components of the research process. So that can sometimes pose a challenge to adhering to and meeting the assumptions of doing anti-racist research. So it definitely requires intentional, ongoing self-reflection. So anyone want to kick us off with, and you can start with, reflections from your group discussion, or if you want to jump in with a question to me.
I have a question, Dr. Francois.
Yes.
I actually have two questions. One, can this be, how do I say this? Is anti-racist research its own theory, or has it been developed into its own theory? I know under the theoretical perspectives portion of your presentation, you discuss various theories that can be applied, that are inherently anti-racist.
Mm-hmm.
But I think about how you said when you would submit some grant proposals, how if you didn't do a comparison group to the Black sample, then that was thought of as a limitation. So is there a way to convert this type of research into its own theory so that it would, when you position your methods, your sampling methods, so that you'd be able to position the sampling methods within the theory itself?
Yeah, I think, thank you for your question, Tiffany, and I think I understand what you're asking. So to answer what I think your first question was, which was, is anti-racist research a theory or conceptual framework in and of itself? And I don't think, kind of the anti-racist research scholars, thinkers, writers would talk about it as a theory or conceptual framework. I'm sorry, let me back up. as a theory so much as it's a framework or an approach or a perspective for how you do research, right? And how you do research in a specific space and context. Also, those theories that I gave, some examples of that you noted, like critical race theory, intersectionality, fundamental cause theory, those theories, I think the tenets and the assumptions of those theories are already aligned with and are mirroring the assumptions and tenets of an anti-racist research framework, that you could ground your research in one of those theories and, and make that case. So for example, I've used critical race theory as a grounding for a research aim or study. And if you're familiar with critical race theory, one of the tenets of CRT is voice of color, where you center the voice of folks of color, right? So in grounding my research in a CRT framework, then I'm, using that as a part of the rationale for why my methods, my participant sample is only African-American adolescents, right? So I think that sort of answers your question. There are, theories, models out there that are already well aligned with an anti-racist research framework. At the same time, in my reading, I don't think that it's been presented as sort of a theory in and of itself. Does that answer your question a bit? Thanks, Tiffany. Other questions or reflections from your small group discussions?
I'll just ask a question then.
Yeah, thanks, man. Go ahead.
Let's break the silence for a second. So this doesn't relate necessarily to the group. I wasn't even able to go. We had so much good conversation, or everybody was sharing a lot. But at least for me, I'm striving to be more of a community grounded researcher, specifically with LGBTQ youth of color. And intersectionality is obviously an obvious kind of approach to thinking about how to work with this population. So one thing I'm kind of struggling with is, I understand theory, at least conceptually, I guess. It's thinking about in practice on each of the steps of a research process, how it works, because I think you brought up some compelling arguments for the methods themselves, the analysis, the dissemination. I can say, for example, like social media posts, who are we often posting to? Because a researcher's, Instagram page often is just other community orgs. Are we really reaching the population of interest? So I'm kind of like thinking more best practices, which I don't like that term, but kind of what I'm getting at in terms of implementing these things.
Yeah, that's a great question, Manny. I have a couple of thoughts in response to that. One, your focal population of LGBTQ youth of color, they can tell you how best to reach those audiences, and the audiences that care about them, that matter to them, that they care about, they can tell you, right? So I think one way, one best practice, and I hate that term too, is to let them tell you where the, if you will, the target audience is most likely to access the information that comes out of your research. The other piece I would say to that is the information that comes out of your research has to be presented in a way that is actually useful and meaningful to them. So, in research enterprise, we have our standard way of presenting research. We lay out our theoretical grounding or our theoretical change. We talk about our methods and approaches, and we share the results, and we present all these pretty graphs and tables. We know, like those of us who are doing work with actual people know that, not that, you know, academicians and researchers aren't actual people, but that's not going to resonate with them. That's not going to speak to them. They're not going to be able to, you know, consume that and do something with it. So again, that's where I think, you know, and I thank you, Manny, for like defining and making specific your community, because something that drives me nuts about, and I actually talked with Myriam about this and preparing for this, is that, you know, when we talk about like community engaged research or community, we never define who community are, right? And if you are doing anti-racist research, you have to define who those folks are. You know, who the focus is, who the audience is, you know, who the, you know, your researchers in arms are. So thank you for naming that. And I think those are the people that I think, you know, I'm borrowing, oh, and I said this somewhere else, and I think it was Audre Lorde, you know, we have the tools of the master at our disposal, but I think we can take those tools and give those tools to our community members, and they can give us new tools, and we can create new tools together for communicating this information. And that is, I want us to start thinking about that. This is information that can be used to do something, right? If it's programmatical, if it's policy-based, if it is, you know, in terms of informing of, you know, some organizing effort. I believe what's inherent in anti-racist research, it's to produce information that can be acted upon. So if we're thinking about it in that way, then we have to be coming up with ways to disseminate it, that it could actually be, you know, or rather made accessible to the people who can actually do something with it, Manny. And I don't know if I'm actually answering your question well enough, but I guess I would sum it to say, like, let those LGBTQ youth of color guide you, because they know. Right? They know, they have the perspective, they know how to get to the people, and they have a perspective on the phenomena of interest, the challenges of interest that, you know, sometimes, you know, academic researchers just don't have, and they will, you know, open up the possibilities for us.
Sam, a question came in the chat box about how to get started in community engaged research and participatory research, if you have any suggestion.
That's a good question. Okay, so I would suggest, and I'm basing this just on my experience as a community engaged researcher and my journey, and I'm still on the journey, right? I'm still learning. You know, I had a mistake with a community partner just this week, right? So I'm still learning, but I do think a good starting point is getting a good grounding in just what people have written about, and there is a lot written about what community-based participatory research is, what its assumptions are, the best ways of proceeding in doing it in terms of identifying and engaging with community-based partners. So I think, you know, especially if you've never done it before, you know, never led a CBPR project or been a part of one, I do think, you know, and you know, at the end of the day, I'm also an academic, right? So I'm still indoctrinated in the power of the written word. But there is some good written word out there about community-based participatory research. So I would say if you're like brand spanking new to it, start there, and just really get kind of a knowledge-based grounding in it. And then, you know, and for the person, I hope I don't mispronounce your name, LaPortia, if I mispronounce it, please forgive me, who asked the question, depending on kind of where you are in your own research process, and you know, okay, this is the approach or the sort of framework that really resonates with the kinds of research questions I want to ask, and the kind of understanding I want to have around the specific phenomena I'm interested in. Then I think another important step is, you know, navigating and negotiating within your institution to support your research, doing community-based participatory research, because our institutions aren't set up to fully support us or make it easy for us to do community-based participatory research, because it is long, it's involved, it's messy, it's complex, but it's also amazing, right? You know, some of the most rich and compelling, I think, knowledge and skills and experiences come out of community-based participatory research engagements. They really, I believe, advance research in, you know, our sort of research enterprise in terms of the tools we have in ways that I think we may not have ever come to had we not engaged outside of our own bubble. But I do think, you know, kind of starting with what's out there published, I have a great resource that I'll add to my reference list before we share these slides for doing community-based participatory research. And then also, you know, start having conversations with the, you know, the folks and colleagues within your department, your school, in your institution, to let them know, like, this is an approach I want to use. Like, what are the ways in which you're going to support me to do this?
I have another question. I'm primarily a quantitative researcher, and I know that, well, understand that this anti-racist research is useful, very useful with qualitative research. Is it as useful or with quantitative? Okay.
Absolutely, and that another great question, Tiffany. My roots are in quantitative research too. It's still sort of, it's my comfort zone. And I do believe you can still employ anti-racist research practices with quantitative approaches, absolutely. So for example, you know, if you're doing kind of survey-based research, as you know, I mentioned under sort of the inclusive methods and measures, have some intentionality and some purposefulness around the measures that you're selecting, right? So this is a very recent example for myself. So some of you on here may be familiar with the everyday discrimination scale. That's a very commonly used scale to measure discrimination experiences. In one sort of research study, the person was finding in their sample, which was largely not largely, it was all African-American, mostly male, that they weren't having very many experiences of discrimination, you know, using this scale. And it's because the scale is very limited in the kinds of discrimination that one has the potential to experience. It's also quite dated. So I'm like, okay, this is not a, you know, and maybe at some point it was a useful, valid, reliable scale with African-American populations, but it's certainly not with this population. So I think, when doing, and, survey research, that's just one example. But there are absolutely ways of, having an anti-racist lens when doing quantitative research. I mean, engaging with, and this is not qualitative methods, right? So engaging with your specifically defined community of interest to shape your research questions, to shape the selection of your measures, to shape how you administer your measures, right? Again, that centers them in the research process. You're still doing quantitative research. I hope that answers a bit.
Sam, thanks so much for putting this session on. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Your answer just now, so relevant to some of the work that we have done in the past and will do again in trying to survey high school students in New Orleans. And I wondered if you're aware, I mean, that's a big challenge for us, right? Is using the right survey questions that are appropriate and are going to capture the right, information for the population of students here. But we can't, we don't have the time and the resources or the background, right, to write our own survey questions. And that discrimination scale is, exactly a problem we had in the first round. Do you have any resources? Do you know of anything? Is anyone compiling resources that are here are the survey instruments and the assessment tools that are valid and reliable and updated for use with non-white middle class?
Man, I wish, Lindsay. I in my free time, that's what I'm doing.
Great. Thank you.
I have the same struggle. So I have, and I am more than happy to share with you the list I've started. Also, if anyone else on here has a response to this, I want to know too. But it really is just kind of digging through published research, talking to, I co-email folks all the time, right? Other researchers across the nation who, they may have created a scale that, or a measurement tool that they may not have done any psychometric work on, but they created it and have some psychometrics for their, use of that scale just for their study. But I'm like, this looks good, right? So I've started to, now Lindsay, don't get excited, it's not a long list, but I've started to put one together, and it is about measures of discrimination, experiences of racism or race-related stress. So it's related to those constructs that I'm more than happy to share with you. And then as I continue to dig, I will share as well. And I'm gonna make a note so I don't forget I said I would do.
Awesome, thanks. Don't worry, I'll email you.
Absolutely, thank you, Lindsay. Yes, please email me. And it's great to see you.
You too.
Thank you so much for all of this. I'm possibly the oddball in here as a visual artist, though my practice is oftentimes research-based, and especially recently. And I've done a lot of work both in the classroom and my own work thinking about the, decolonizing photography specifically, because its history is a very, very complicated and very racist one. And so we do that in the classroom with my students, and I also try to work with that in my own work, read a lot about it. I'm wondering if what I haven't seen a lot of information about is things that sort of lean in the direction of visual art and research in that territory that talks about sort of any sort of anti-racist research that is of the visual rather than of the, I don't do graphs when you're talking about the specific ways that everything goes out like this. I'm like, oh, every time I make something, it goes out in that one's a video and that one's a, so I'm working in a really different way. And I'm wondering if you've ever seen anyone talking about how to do that process. I'm doing the best, right? Making it up as
Yeah, Sean, so this is not my wheelhouse at all, but I have awareness of, it's the Center for Arts and Health based at University of Florida. And And I know there is a component of their work where they are examining ways to like construct ways of measuring and doing research on the intersection of arts and health and public health. And they define arts pretty widely. So inclusive of visual arts, but also, you know, performance arts, music, and other art forms. I will, again, if you email me, I can send you a link to contact there, but that is probably the only resource I would have to offer in that space.
I think for me, what I sort of follow the route of is sort of community organizers and performance and like work that is community facing and performance art and all, and you know, community art based things like that seems to be the way that I've been looking at it. But yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
We've run out of time. Yeah. A couple of folks will follow up with you with questions. Perfect. But thank you so much, Dr. Francois, and thank you all for joining us.